You can review these notes that we went over together again if you'd like to take a look at those definitions for traits, feelings, and motivations. Then you're going to move on to the activity, which we'll do together in a moment. We're going to compare the character traits, feelings, and motivations with a Venn diagram. Okay, so I've created mine, but you can also find one right here. And again, it's very similar to mine. There's a section for you to write the names of each of your characters or groups of characters, and then a section in the middle here. Anytime that we're using a Venn diagram, we are using the bigger sections to show the differences between the characters, and we're using that middle section to show the similarities of the characters. So this is what makes character A unique, any traits, feelings, motivations, or other things that you list in this section. Then on this side, anything that you list in this section is going to be unique to character B. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and flip back to mine so we can get started. You might notice that my Venn diagram also has some space for a paragraph underneath. The reason why mine looks like that is because next week, your task is not only going to be to complete a Venn diagram like you will this week, but to also create a paragraph with the Venn diagram. Again, that is not due until next week. This week's task is just the Venn diagram, but I'm going to show you both so that you're prepared for next week, and you can return to this video if you'd like to during both the Venn diagram today and then the Venn diagram and paragraph for next week. So you can see here your task next week, and what I'm going to show you today in addition to the Venn diagram is to write a paragraph to describe how the characters are similar or different using text evidence to support your opinion. All right, so after I create my Venn diagram and our characters from Verdi, I am going to show you what it looks like to use that Venn diagram to guide a paragraph on the similarities. You can pick one or the other. Today we're going to, we're going to write a paragraph on the differences. You can pick one or the other. I'm going to focus on the differences. Okay, so let's get back to work here. All right, so I'm going to use the notes we took during our reading to help me create this Venn diagram. And I'm just going to go one by one from traits to feelings to motivations to continue reviewing those things and what they really mean. So starting with traits. Some traits that we found in Verdi was that he has an energetic and outgoing personality. And I'm just going to pause this for a moment and pause my video. Okay, sorry about that. Just experiencing some technical difficulties, but I think we might be back on track. Maybe not. Let's try this again. Okay. So what I was saying was that we're listing the traits of our characters first, starting with Verdi's traits. While we were reading, we found that he had a really energetic and outgoing personality. Some of the traits of the old Greens, however, were very opposite of Verdi's traits and included laziness. Ooh, sorry, my dogs are feeling very unhappy or excited right now. It's hard to say from the next round. But the old Greens traits were lazy and boring. Okay. Then when we look at our characters' feelings, remember feelings that were passing through time, we found that Verdi was really excited about doing new things, including many of his new tricks that he did. Remember when he flew through the air? Okay, so he was excited to try new tricks. Or he felt excited as he tried his new tricks. while the old greens, on the other hand, felt very worried or concerned for Verdi when he did his tricks. Okay. About motivations. This one's a little bit more challenging to include. Going to shorten the motivations a little bit. So really remember that Verdi's motivation we'd written in our notes was to stay yellow and active, or at least at one point in the story, that was his motivation. It does change a little bit through the end. He realizes he can't keep himself from turning green, but he can keep himself from becoming totally boring. And in the end, that message was really for him to stay true to himself. So for Verdi's motivation, I'm going to include on my Venn diagram that he remains true to himself. It's kind of like the theme of the story as well. He remains true to self even as he grows up. All right, then for the old greens motivation, we'd mentioned in our notes that we learned they were motivated to have a quiet life because they'd already had their fun. Okay, so their motivation is to stick to a slow and safe lifestyle. You don't see them doing any figure eights through the story. All right, so that takes care of their different traits, feelings, and motivations. But remember, we still have this section in the middle that highlights traits, feelings, and motivations that both of these characters shared or had in common. So some things we found in the story were that both Verdi and the old greens do physically go from the color yellow to the color green. And that's not necessarily a trait, feeling, or a motivation, but it is something that I want to include as something they both experienced. Okay. They also used to be very active. Verdi remains somewhat active from time to time. The old greens, we learned, do not like to be active anymore because they used to be super active, so much so that they even got hurt sometimes. So that's something that they share in common as well. It's a similarity. And then one trait that we found that they do have in common is that both Verdi and the old greens became very observant at one point. Remember, observant means that they watch and listen very closely to the things going on around them. So I'm going to include that in our middle section as well. All right, we've just about completed our Venn diagram here, which means that it is time to write our compare and contrast paragraph next. And I've mentioned that I'd like to complete my paragraph on their differences today. And one reason I decided to choose a paragraph on differences instead of similarities is because when I look at my Venn diagram and I think back to my story, there were more supporting reasons for what made these characters different than what made them similar. So I'm going to have more support to write about because of that. Okay, so the first sentence I want to include is just one that states whether I'm talking about similarities or differences. Okay, so I'm going to start with Verdi is different, since we're talking about the differences. Verdi is different from the older green snakes for several reasons, or for more than one reason. Okay, so the reason why I said this is because now the next thing we're going to do is actually list the reasons how they are different. Verdi can be described as, and if I've forgotten how we can describe Verdi's traits, I can just look right back up here in my Venn diagram. That's right. We said some of the traits we found in Verdi were that he was energetic and outgoing. So Verdi can be described as having an energetic or outgoing personality. Okay, the greens, on the other hand, we said were very lazy and boring. While the greens were lazy and boring. Oops. And again, I'm just using those traits we found and listed in our Venn diagram. And you can see that they're right across from each other too, since we listed their traits at the same time. Verdi was energetic and outgoing. The greens were lazy and boring. Okay, so put that into full sentences beneath. Remember, a paragraph needs to have a full thought from start to finish in each sentence. Okay? So that's one thing that makes them different. Oh, sorry. Okay. Let's see. We see this difference. Remember, we want to include text evidence. So I'm going to be a little more specific. We see this difference in the text as Verdi fearlessly tries new tricks. Excuse me for a moment. All right, so here we just included a sentence with that evidence that we needed. We'd mentioned in the earlier sentence that Verdi could be described as energetic, and we are now supporting that with some evidence. One way that he was energetic was by trying all of those new tricks. Okay. The greens, on the other hand, did not enjoy tricks. They preferred to stay put and watch from afar. The greens preferred to stay put on their branches and watch from afar. Again, that is supporting what we'd said earlier. That is some evidence that supports our fact that we'd mentioned they were lazy and boring. Even as Verdi grows up, he remains different from the greens in some ways. When we look back on our notes, we can see he remained true to himself as he grew up. And one way we could support that was by thinking about the end of the text, how he interacts with those young yellows. And even though he's old and a little bit worried about hurting himself, he shows them the figure 8 trick. So even as Verdi grows up, he is different than the greens, or different than other greens, because he was green at this point too. Because he remains brave enough to show the young yellows his figure 8. Okay, that concludes our paragraph. Now let's reread it to make sure that it makes sense and goes with the notes we'd taken in our Venn diagram.